Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm here to do a spoiler-free book review of the book Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, a book that sent me down a big rabbit hole on the topic of IQ. What is IQ? How is it measured? What are the normal ranges? What does this tell you? How is this important? All of that stuff, and I'm going to get to it after I talk a little bit about the book. But the reason I purchased this book, with the help of my Patreon supporters who give me a nice little entertainment budget every month, was because I heard a lot of rave reviews about it, including from a booktuber named Zara from the channel Books with Zara. And Zara, between her video essays and her book reviews, has some of the most interesting and thought-provoking content in my limited experience on BookTube. And I came to fairly different conclusions than Zara did, so I would highly encourage you, after you watch my review, to check out Zara's review about this book, which I'm going to link below, because you should really never take my word as gospel. You should definitely hear from other people who have other views, other opinions, other life experiences, other beliefs. Don't take what I say as the gospel truth. So I will link that below. Please do check it out. I'm going to start off with the briefest of spoiler-free plot summaries, and I hope you don't mind that I keep these summaries very brief, because even with this book, when I was watching so-called spoiler-free reviews about it, the reviewers did spoil things that I thought were kind of crucial to the plot that I really wish I hadn't been spoiled on. So I'm going to be very brief as usual. And I'm basically just going to tell you that the book is about a character named Charlie Gordon. And the book is written from Charlie Gordon's point of view in the form of diary entries. So I think this would be called an epistolary novel. I don't know if that's correct, if the whole thing is written as diary entries, if that's the format. And normally that would turn me off from a book. I don't necessarily want a book written in that style, but it totally works for this one. I'll talk about the writing in just a second here. But essentially, Charlie is a very low IQ individual who is able to still live a relatively independent life because he has a job at a bakery, but he does want to improve his knowledge and learning. So he's also going and taking classes from a school that caters to people with intellectual disabilities. And because of his interest in learning and his overall, I guess, personality, he's been recommended by his teacher to a couple of scientists who have discovered a procedure that can be done through surgery and whatever else to make adjustments in a person's brain that will allow them to very rapidly gain an extremely high IQ. And so they believe they've gotten their science to the point where they can now do this on a human, having experimented previously on rats. One of the rats they experimented on is named Algernon, which is why the title of the book is what it is. And so Charlie is chosen and agrees as much as he can with his intellectual limitations to go under this procedure to have his intelligence raised. And Charlie has his own motivation for wanting to be more intelligent. So one reason he was taking the classes initially was so he could learn to write and read, because he thought that would make him a better person overall. But here is one thing he says early on in the story about his motivation. He says, "When I become intelligent, the way Professor Niemeyer says, with much more than twice my IQ of 70, then maybe people will like me and be my friends." So he already, in his current intellectual state, sees himself as being much lower, I guess, on the social totem pole than people of average or better intelligence, and he thinks that he will be better liked if he is smarter. And the procedure is successful in that regard, in that his intelligence goes absolutely through the roof. And it's only after Charlie's intelligence level becomes very high that he realizes that his own value as a human being really shouldn't be connected to intelligence. And he says here, talking about another character in the book, "There was always the pat on the shoulder, the smile, the encouraging word that came my way so rarely. He treated me, even then, as a human being. It may sound like ingratitude, but that is one of the things that I resent here, the attitude that I am a guinea pig. Niemeyer's constant references to having made me what I am, or that someday there will be others like me who will become real human beings. How can I make him understand that he did not create me? He makes the same mistake as the others when they look at a feeble-minded person and laugh because they don't understand there are human feelings involved. He doesn't realize that I was a person before I came here. And so yeah, this attitude is even coming from the professors and other people around him, that he was almost subhuman when he was of low intelligence. And it got me thinking that this idea between low intelligence and not being a worthy human in normal society is almost like how we treat people of low income too, don't we? Especially those who are on the streets and don't have homes. We look at these low income people and we don't necessarily see them as being fully human either. And I found that to be an interesting comparison. But what follows for the rest of the book are all the various implications of that and the various things that Charlie has to deal with as a result. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave it off. It is, of course, a science fiction novel, simply because of this aspect of a fictional scientific procedure, but otherwise it's written in very much a modern day real world setting. There's no weird spaceships or aliens or anything like that. It's just this kind of strange scientific procedure they've come up with to really shoot a person's IQ through the roof. So the way the book is written is really well done. Like I said, it's written through these journal entries written by Charlie himself as he goes through all the progress that he goes through. And the really clever part about it is that because he is writing first as a very low IQ individual, his writing initially has a lot of really terrible spelling and grammar errors, although it's funny to see an author who writes well trying to write as somebody who can't write well, because there's things you notice that go, okay, if you really didn't have writing knowledge, you might not exactly present it that way. But anyways, as Charlie's intelligence begins to rapidly grow, so does his writing rapidly improve to the point where eventually he's writing in very literate and thoughtful prose. So that is very interesting. The other thing about the writing is that this book definitely presents the ultimate character progression. So when we talk about good stories, we often talk about character arcs and character progression, and we naturally have this incredible character progression as Charlie goes from this very low intelligence person to somebody who is of extraordinarily high intelligence, and sort of deals with things that go along with that, and maybe other parts of him that do not keep up with the pace of his actual intelligence. So between the writing and character progression, there's definitely some really great writing going on from Daniel Keyes here. Having said that, though, there are some things that I really strongly dislike about this book. One of the things is not necessarily a bad thing in that it's a product of its time. This book was published in 1966, and so Charlie's low intelligence is constantly referred to in some sort of mental retardation. So various forms of the word retard and retardate are used as descriptives for Charlie, which, like I said, is the language of the time. It's not meant to be an offensive thing, even though that term is out of practice nowadays. But the things that really bother me a lot more are the author's treatment of men and women in particular. One example is when the mention of homosexuality comes up, there is a very strong negative reaction to it. So a female character is speaking with Charlie and says, "Charlie, I can't figure you out. Most men like me or not, and I know it right away. But you seem afraid of me. You're not a homosexual, are you?" Hell no. I mean, you don't have to hide it from me if you are, because then we could just be good friends. But I'd have to know. I'm not a homosexual. And so there's this strong, indignant reaction as if homosexuality is a very negative thing. And again, in the 1960s, perhaps if it is much more looked at that way, then hopefully more enlightened people today do. But the thing that was even worse is how women in general are treated throughout the story. So there's really two kind of main female characters in the book. There's the teacher that was teaching Charlie when he was taking this class for people with intellectual disabilities, and the one who recommended him to the scientific program. And she remains friends with him and uncomfortably is kind of throwing herself sexually at him after he gains an increased level of intelligence, which, you know, for a teacher-student relationship is pretty awkward to begin with. But then we have this other female character that gets introduced, the one who was just speaking in the quote that I read here, who is a neighbor of Charlie's, and she's presented in this very stereotypical 1960s free love hippie way. Although, to be honest, she is pretty much the only fun character in this entire book. But anyways, she also is trying to throw herself sexually at Charlie. So the only two main characters who are women in the story are both kind of throwing their bodies at Charlie, which is a little bit weird. But then eventually when Charlie gets over his initial awkwardness about sexual relationships, he starts throwing himself at this hippie lady to the point where he's pushing himself on her even against her consent. So there is one point in which he's trying to, I guess, have sex with her, and it says she backed away, and then she says, "Oh, wait a minute, Charlie boy, we've been through all this before. You know it doesn't do any good. I mean, you know I think a lot of you, and I'd drag you into bed in a minute if I thought there was a chance, but I don't want to get all worked up for nothing. It's not fair, Charlie. It'll be different tonight, I swear." Before she could protest, I had her in my arms, kissing her, caressing her, overwhelming her with all the built-up excitement that was ready to tear me apart. I tried to unhook her brassiere, but I pulled too hard, and the hook tore out. "For God's sake, Charlie, my bra!" "Don't worry about your bra," I choked, helping her to take it off. "I'll buy you a new one. I'm going to make up for the other times. I'm going to make love to you all night long." She pulled away from me. "Charlie, I've never heard you talk like that. And stop looking at me as if you want to swallow me whole." So it goes on a bit like that, where she's trying to put him off and he's trying to force himself on her, which is obviously pretty horrible. But even when he develops more of a semblance of a relatively normal relationship with the teacher character, the way he looks at her and her role in his life is also pretty awful. And so Charlie, in this instance, is considering the way that he tends to be very irritable towards Alice, the teacher lady, and he asks himself, "But why am I so irritable, especially when Alice is so good to me? She keeps the place neat and clean, always putting my things away and washing dishes and scrubbing floors. I shouldn't have shouted at her the way I did this morning because it made her cry, and I didn't want that to happen." And so her value to him in their relationship is the fact that she keeps his place neat and clean. She puts things away and she washes the dishes and scrubs the floor. I'm like, oh my God, even for 1960s, that seems to be a pretty terrible outlook on man-woman relationships. And so to sum this part up, I will say that after I read the book and was feeling not very good about quite a lot of it, I decided to go onto GoodReads and have a look at the reviews and see why people seem to mostly differ, in my opinion, because it has quite a high rating on GoodReads overall, and a lot of people, like I said, speak very, very highly of the book. So I thought I want to read both some positive and negative ratings to see if I'm the only one who's coming away from this book going, what exactly is the reason people are falling over themselves praising this book. And I found a really very smart comment from somebody named Anne on GoodReads, and this was the way she talked about the author's approach to women in the story. She says, and I quote from her review, "Books from this era just bug me in general. They are so smugly sure of their analysis of the whys and wherefores of human nature, yet they still cling to the archetypes." And here she's going to capitalize some terms in order to indicate the archetype she's speaking about. So she says, "Charlie knows the puffed up scientist and the down-to-earth scientist. The women in his life are the cruel mother, the whore, and the angel. One of the reasons this book screams the 1960s is because the angel is okay with his relationship with the whore. In fact, she encourages it. Brilliant. Can we tell the author was a man and the book was written in the era of free love? All of this in a book that is supposed to be about a man coming to grips with newfound intelligence without turning into an intellectual jerk and divining the real nature of the women in his life. Am I the only one who sees the irony of this? People were and are gaga about this book. And while I think that the premise is interesting, all the fuss surrounding the premise was formulaic." And that is very well stated in the way that the female characters in particular are presented in the book. Now, before I go on to give my rating and conclude this review, I did mention I went down a big rabbit hole because prior to reading this book, I knew very little about IQ tests or any of the issues surrounding them. And I did a whole bunch of research. First of all, I wanted to know what sort of things specifically IQ tests look at. And so we have I guess, 5 main components of an IQ test. They look at first verbal comprehension, which measures your ability to understand and interpret written information, vocabulary, and language. They then look at perceptual reasoning, which assesses spatial recognition and your ability to solve visual puzzles and interpret visual patterns. It then looks at working memory, testing your ability to hold and recall information in your mind over a short period. Then processing speed evaluates how quickly you can complete activities and solve puzzles, because essentially the whole thing is timed. And then finally, we have logical and numerical reasoning, which includes questions that require mathematical ability and logical deduction to solve problems. So the language component looks at words and the best definitions to describe those specific words. It gives logic puzzles in word format. They also present series of numbers and say what number is missing from this series of patterned numbers, or what number is incorrect in the series. They also give these spatial puzzles that say, if a puzzle looks like this one way, if we flip it a different direction, how will it look? And then there's also, similar to the number patterns, there are actual visual shape patterns where if a puzzle shape looks like this, and then this, and then this in this progression, then what will it look at in the following shape progression? And so all of these are based around words, numbers, and shapes mostly. Now, I discovered that the averages give a nice, neat kind of bell chart of the normative distribution, where 100 is the average result of an IQ test, and apparently nearly 70% of people fall within the range of 85 to 115 on a normal IQ test. Apparently, anyone who is less than 70 is in the bottom 2% and is considered to be intellectually disabled, which I found interesting because we read earlier that Charlie stated his IQ was 70, which is only the starting point of what is considered to be intellectual disability, whereas Charlie's really shown to be profoundly intellectually disadvantaged in the story, although not so much that he can't write with bad spelling and grammar, I guess, to express his thoughts. So I would, based on how they presented him in the book, I would have thought he would be lower in comparison to what they show as being an intellectually disabled number. And then finally, for the top half of things, or the top part of things, anything that is in the top 2% or the 98th percentile, which is approximately 130 depending on the specific test, qualifies people for a Mensa membership, which I'm going to talk more about in a second. It's a club for people who score high on IQ tests. And that being said, there are different types of tests that vary a little bit from one to the other, and they give slightly different scores, but these are just all averages. The other thing I found out is that to prepare to take an IQ test, you're supposed to study for it by doing practice questions and getting your mind geared towards solving specific types of logic problems, which off the bat had me going, so you're not necessarily studying natural intelligence, whatever that means, because you're able to prepare and study in a way to take these tests. The other thing that, again, as I get into some problematic elements of IQ testing, is clearly this is designed for neurotypical people specifically, because I'm going to talk about, I looked at some example tests online, but when I was going through them, I realized that somebody like my younger son Wyatt, for example, who has been diagnosed with ADHD and a couple of learning disabilities, would do very poorly on an IQ test with the way that they are set up. However, when he was being tested for these diagnoses, he was also found to have very high intelligence. He was something like in the top 16% for his actual intelligence for some reason, and yet if he did one of these IQ tests, he would perform very poorly on it, which makes me question the structure of the tests. I also started to wonder how much of what it's measuring, this intelligence, is a natural genetic thing, and how much comes from the environment in which you're raised and or from your education. And it seems that people don't really know this all too well. I mean, the brain is such a wildly mysterious thing. We know very little about our own brains. I guess the best theories are there's a certain amount of natural intelligence that you're born with and a certain amount that you learn and acquire as you grow up. which brings to mind some ways in which it could obviously be abused if, for example, we started forcing all children to take IQ tests and then based on the results funneled them into different directions, higher IQ tests into more successful career paths, lower IQs into more menial, low-paying jobs. Humanity has obviously done worse things in the past. And obviously, you're dealing with things like, well, how much of it have they just not had a chance to obtain that knowledge and intelligence, and how much, like my son Wyatt, would fall on the wrong pathway because of his differences in the way his brain functions, which is already seen in the way he struggles with the way our schooling is set up. I mean, obviously our education system and all the ways in which it tries to educate our young people is geared towards a very specific person who has a very specific type of brain, which unfortunately, my very smart son Wyatt is not geared towards naturally. And then, of course, one thing I realized very quickly is that it's not measuring social intelligence, a person's ability to interact socially with the members of their community, with other people that they have relationships with. It doesn't measure a person's emotional intelligence. And so it's measuring just a very, very specific type of intelligence, the ability to deal with language, numbers, and shapes and patterns. Which then brings up a whole series of other questions, some of which are asked in this book here, which is fantastic as we get into this whole thematic exploration of the book, looking at, okay, so how does Charlie's life differ when he's very low intelligence versus very high intelligence? What advantages has he gained from increasing his intelligence? What disadvantages has he gained from increasing his intelligence? And so questions that came into my mind after reading this book and after doing some research about IQ tests are, did increasing his IQ make his life better or worse? And to the author's credit, that's kind of one of the major thematic explorations of the book. Secondly, I asked myself, did having a higher IQ make him a better person or a worse person? And how important is intelligence alongside traits like kindness, respect, empathy, and so on? I then asked myself, do people with low intelligence also have very poor memory? And is that part of why they have low intelligence? Because, as I mentioned, the tests measures your ability to hold certain information in your head. It also rewards people who study ahead of time and obviously gain that certain level of knowledge to carry forward into the test. So does memory affect intelligence? And then finally, I'm asking, what value is there in having this specific type of intelligence? And is it a lot like being born wealthy, where you already start off with certain advantages because of the way our society is structured that give you a certain unfair advantage over other people? So as I thought about the type of questions that I would like to ask in a test that gives a more holistic outlook on who a person is, I would personally want to ask questions like, what makes a good parent? What makes a good partner? What is important for a fulfilling human life? How can the average person improve their mental well-being? And then here's some example problems. Your friend tells you that they have just lost a very close loved one. What do you say and do? You're coming back from a late night event at 2 a.m. and you see a man dragging an apparently highly intoxicated woman down a dark alley. What do you say and do? Or your child admits to you that they're addicted to opiates. What do you say and do? To me, those are much more important questions than what number is missing from this sequence. Having said all that, I did find some sample questions that you could do online. There were a few places that you could kind of do some of these portions of the IQ tests and get some preliminary scores, with the caveat that they're only asking a small handful of questions, so you're not going to get reliable results. And being free online tests, they're also not official, so they might be wildly inaccurate. And then just from my own perspective, the disadvantages I have coming into doing these type of things is I personally have almost no post-secondary education, in that after high school, I did 1 year of career training, and then I began my career as a paramedic. So back in the mid-90s, when I graduated high school, it was then called the Ambulance and Emergency Care Program, and it was just a 1-year college program. I was the only one who was accepted straight out of high school, though, because of certain things like the grades I was achieving in high school and so forth. Everybody else had done at least a year of pre-health sciences in college, and most other people had done some other smaller degrees in biology and whatnot. But anyways, I only did the 1 year of school. Nowadays, I will add that the course is now called the paramedic program, and it's a 2-year college program in addition to whatever pre-health sciences people choose to take. But yeah, I basically don't really have any post-secondary education. And of course, I went into these tests cold without doing any study or pre-testing preparation. But anyways, it was interesting to see some results. So the first thing I did was I found a website called 123test.com, which only asked 10 questions, which again, you're not going to get any sort of accuracy with 10 questions, but I scored 9 out of 10, and they told me that that indicates an IQ of 125 plus, taken with a giant grain of salt because of the only 10 questions thing. Next, I went to another place called cognitivemetrics.com, and this is one where I took only the word-based section of the test that talked about word definitions and word-based logic puzzles and that sort of thing. And this is where I absolutely shine. Obviously, having been an avid reader since I was could hold a book in my hands, and having enjoyed reading and writing and even done a bit of freelance editing in a couple of occasions and so forth, words and reading and language are my thing. And that was reflected in the fact that they told me that I scored 140, or like the top 1% of IQ test results for only the word-based section. Again, taking it with a massive grain of salt, being that it was a free online thing. With the numbers and shapes, I didn't score as high as that. I went to Mensa.org and did a couple of their quick things involving only, well, the first one was shape and number patterns. So basically everything except the word stuff. And I was told that my IQ equivalent based on that would be 118. I then did one on the same website, Mensa.org, that was only shape patterns and pattern recognition, and I was 124 on that. So again, not results that should be taken seriously, but interesting indicators that if I did a real IQ test, I might perform pretty decently on it, with the word-based section pulling my score up pretty high. It got me curious that, could I pull it up to a 130 to qualify for a Mensa membership? It seems unlikely with the number section of it pulling me down a bit, but might be fun to try. So that led me then to Mensa and trying to figure out what that was all about. And I found out that there are a few of these exclusive clubs for high IQ testing people. Mensa seems to be the most popular of them. But I was like, what would be the advantage of being a Mensa membership? What positive things would that add to my life? And so on the Mensa website, they have a question, why join Mensa? And this is what they say on their website. Becoming a member of Mensa can add new dimensions to your life. Intriguing. Making new friends and finding intellectual stimulation are givens, but what may be even more important is the feeling of belonging that grows when you are surrounded by honest-to-goodness peers, people who are unique, yet paradoxically are very much like you, inquisitive, fun-loving, open to new ideas and alternative viewpoints, and well-read. And then when I started to actually think about that, I was like, this is how you view yourselves? You view yourselves as inquisitive, which anybody who is curious, regardless of your IQ, it can be inquisitive. Fun-loving. That's literally everybody. Everybody loves fun. Why would you say that high IQ people are the fun-loving ones? And then open to new ideas and alternative viewpoints. That just means you're an open-minded person, a good person. You don't have to have a high IQ to be a good person. And well-read. A couple of questions there. I'd love to know what their definition of well-read is. Is it very specific types of literature? Or does it mean you just read a lot? In which case, once again, that could be literally anybody. So it's a little suspicious that these are the traits they're saying that their members have, when literally none of them, I don't think, are applicable to only people with high IQs. The only really tangible benefits I could see were some students apparently can get scholarships with a Mensa membership, so there might be some incentive for somebody who's a student to score high. There was also the occasional mention of being able to get reduced insurance rates in certain areas. So I looked up my insurance company. I was like, if I have a Mensa membership, can I get a discount on my insurance? And no, I can't. So it was all very, very strange, because you would think that the people with the highest IQs should be the first to realize that having an extremely high IQ doesn't make you a better person in any way, and might be a largely unimportant metric, in fact, based on the questions they ask in the test there. It feels, and again, this is just based on a bit of online research, it feels like almost a ego boost to be part of this exclusive club and to feel above other people, which makes me wonder if I'd be going too far to be worried about at least a little bit of overlap with things like phrenology, eugenics, Aryanism, all these crazy things that people have latched onto in the past and used to separate certain groups of people from other people. Do high IQ people not realize that there could be some problematic issues at work here? That being said, I did really have fun taking these online practice tests, because on a daily basis, from pretty much every day, I am doing word puzzles for fun in the form of things like crossword puzzles and Wordle and that sort of thing. I'm doing number puzzles, things like Sudoku. I'm doing chess puzzles on chess.com, and just on a day-to-day basis, I'm doing both word and number and chess puzzles just as a fun activity, and to try to keep my brain engaged and to do what I can to stave off the effects of aging. And so doing these practice puzzles made me realize, oh, this is all the stuff I do for fun. It's just logic puzzles. This is actually really quite a fun thing to play around with, which made me then wonder if I should make another video completely devoted to this topic, where I actually go through the process of taking an official IQ test and then sharing my results, whether below average or above average. Is that something that might be fun to do? It would cost a little bit of money, but I could take my entertainment budget from my wonderful Patreon supporters and put it towards taking one of these tests. I do wonder, though, if it's a lose-lose situation. Like, if I score below average, will people who watch me on YouTube go, this guy's just an idiot, he has no idea what he's talking about? Or if I score above average, will people go, why is this braggart talking about what his IQ score is? What an absolute loser. I will add that the truth is that there are other areas of my life where, like I talked about emotional intelligence, I am not at all an emotionally intelligent person. I am a very emotionally repressed person and don't handle my emotions well whatsoever. So even if this type of testing puts me in a good light, it does not in any sense put me in a complete overall human light. And so I guess here's where I need your opinions. You can be my voice of reason. Do you think this would be a fun video to check out, or do you think it would be a disaster, or just absolutely not worth doing? I'm going to be 100% transparent and say the fact that early indications showing that I would score quite well on these tests is definitely a motivation, because it could be something that would boost my ego and make me feel better about myself. So would I be as inclined to pursue it if these early tests showed I was below average? If I probably wouldn't be as eager to do it. I might still be curious, but it might slow me down, certainly. So again, being transparent with you, there's an element of ego at play, and I don't want to come across as being somebody who puts myself on a pedestal above other people. Definitely not. And in fact, I laughed at this quote that I saw that said, when somebody approached the great physicist Stephen Hawking, an absolutely brilliant mind, and asked Stephen Hawking what his IQ was, his reply was, I have no idea. People who boast about their IQ are losers. That being said, I'm honestly not too worried about shooting myself in the foot, as it were. I don't do things here on YouTube that are particularly popular. Obviously, the fact that my subscriber count has actually been dropping somewhat over the past couple of months shows that I'm not striving to be a particularly likable or successful YouTuber. I'm just trying to maintain honesty, integrity, and film the types of videos that I want to make. And this could be just another one of those disasters that I present to you just because I enjoy doing it. So anyways, do let me get into the comments. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. But let's wrap this book up with a bit of a conclusion and give my final rating. There are a couple of quotes that I really liked. We have a point where Charlie has this high IQ, and he is speaking with the professor who gave him this wonderful gift of a high IQ, and Ymir is scolding him, saying, "You've become cynical," said Ymir. "That's all this opportunity has meant to you. Your genius has destroyed your faith in the world and in your fellow men." "That's not completely true," I said softly. "But I've learned that intelligence alone doesn't mean a damned thing. Here in your university, intelligence, education, knowledge have all become great idols. But I know now there's one thing you've all overlooked. Intelligence and education that hasn't been tempered by human affection isn't worth a damn." "Don't misunderstand me," I said. "Intelligence is one of the greatest human gifts. But all too often, a search for knowledge drives out the search for love. This is something else I've discovered for myself very recently. I present it to you as a hypothesis. Intelligence without the ability to give and receive affection leads to mental and moral breakdown, to neurosis, and possibly even psychosis. And I say that the mind absorbed in and involved in itself as a self-centered end, to the exclusion of human relationships, can only lead to violence and pain." That's a really great perspective, I think. And then the final thing I'll look at here is the people who really truly had fulfilling lives. And at one point, Charlie is touring it's almost like a nursing home, I guess. It's a live-in care home that is for people with profoundly disabling intellectual disabilities who aren't able to support themselves. And he's talking about the staff who work in this home, saying, well, first talking about the residents of the home themselves and the type of lives they're leading. He says, "There had been no talk of rehabilitation, of cure, of someday sending these people out into the world again. No one had spoken of hope. The feeling was of living death, or worse, of never having been fully alive and knowing. Souls withered from the beginning and doomed to stare into the time and space of every day. I wondered about the house mother with her red-blotched face, and the stuttering shop teacher, and the motherly principal, and youthful, tired-looking psychologist, and I wished I knew how they had found their way here to work and dedicate themselves to these silent minds. Like the boy who held the younger one in his arms, each had found a fulfillment in giving away a part of himself to those who had less." And that is where fulfillment in life comes from, is giving away parts of yourself to people who have need of it, and making the world around you a better place, and the people around you better people. In comparison to that, IQ is meaningless garbage. From my point of view, IQ does not measure the things that are actually important. Empathy, kindness, and respect. These are the three pillars that I think we need to base our lives around. So, at the end of the day, my rating of the book is a bit of a push-pull between the good writing, the really interesting themes, and the way that women in particular were presented, and certain aspects like that really turned me off. But the biggest thing was, this was an absolutely miserable book to read from start to finish. Just full of misery, anger, nastiness, unkindness, people being horrible. And it was not a fun read. It was one that I had to struggle a bit to come back to. Although the story was interesting enough that it did keep me coming in spite of the way it made me feel, the really profoundly depressed mood it left me in. And because of that kind of push-pull, I've settled on a rating of 5 out of 10, pretty much right in the middle. I don't know if I necessarily recommend it. If what I have described to you sounds interesting to you, you might want to check it out. Like I said, I really, really recommend you check out Zara's review, which I've linked below, because for her, this was one of the best books she's ever read at the time that she had read it. And so she has some good things to say from her perspective as somebody who really loved the book. Don't just take my opinion. Definitely go check out hers as well to get a different point of view. And that's where I'll leave it. I would love to hear, like I said, what you think about me continuing to explore this whole IQ thing. I would love to hear what you've been reading lately. Are there any books in particular that you'd recommend I check out, or that you've just been enjoying a lot? Please do get into the comments and let me know. And I really appreciate you watching. Cheers. A book that sent me down quite a deep rabbit hole. And one of these things is, one example is how, when the mention of homosexual, in terms of average scores of, or to me, those are much more